stream is live.
Okay, I'll go introduce the topic here. All right, next we have cyber and physical resilience in the CIP standards. I'm excited to welcome really a wealth of information from some WEC staff here. We have a great panel. Tom Williams is the manager of CIP monitoring at WEC. And Tom, we've got some of your team here, and turn it over to you to introduce them and to get the program going. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Wow. This is amazing. I am so energized to be with you here today. This is really a paradox for an introvert and not quite sure how to handle that. So this is so fun. Thank you. It is so amazing to see you. There are so many from WEC in the room today. So many auditors here, 3 of whom are on the stage, and we'll do introductions in a second. We are really happy to see you. And this has been a great experience. I'm so happy. Do you remember, it's been 3 years almost to the day, October 24th, 2019, when many of us convened in Las Vegas. 3 years. And there are many new faces in the room, which excites me a lot as I get closer to retirement. Don't worry, not getting rid of me yet. Pablo, I've tied the regulatory horses to the post, and they won't be joining us today. We're going to talk about resilience, not compliance. A little bit of compliance. You can lead a regulatory horse to water, but you can't make it drink. I'd like to think of WEC as a regulatory horse of a different color. Okay, I'll stop. I've had some comments on my tie, my bolo tie. I know you can't see it. It's an eye. And I've been asked, is it an evil eye? Well, of course not. Is it an all-seeing auditor eye? No. It's not that either. It's actually the eye of Ra, but it's a fun kind of visual pun because BOLO is actually an acronym in our CIP world. If you have a law enforcement background or a CIP 6 background, you know that a BOLO system, BOLO stands for be on the lookout. And it's just an interesting coincidence, right? Aldo checked me on this later, but I think bolo comes from a Spanish word, boleadora, meaning lariat. I'm not sure about that. Maybe, I'm sure there are many people in the room who can check me on that. But okay, just doing a nervousness check here. Not bad. It's been a long time since I've been up here in front of a crowd, and I love it. I'm energized, as I told you. Let me introduce the topic, and then we'll introduce the panel with a couple questions. And then I will give share with you some perspectives on resilience from DoD, NIST, DOE, and CIP. And then we'll get into the main panel questions. Resilience is about assuming breach. What confidence do you have that they are not already embedded in your systems? Don't mean to alarm you, but I have a high level of confidence that that has already happened and that there are cases where they are biding their time for geopolitical reasons, for example. What happens when it happens? How do you bounce back? How do you recover? That's what we're talking about today. We're not talking about protection. Protection is a little bit old school, and we'll get more into that in a second. One more introduction to resilience, and then we'll introduce the team here. I'm going to do it by way of a math problem. Show of hands if you just experienced mild panic. The math problem is this. For every day in September, you take a 6-minute shower. For how many hours would you have been in the shower? Your hint is 30 days, half September, April, June, and November. Shout it out. Thank you. So I have an idea. I'm going to put on my IT efficiency hat. And this is going to seem ridiculous to you, but this is how we think sometimes in IT. I'm going to take 1 3-hour shower in the month. And then I will free up 5 times 6 equals 30 minutes of work time every week. Oh, so 2+ hours of additional work time in the month because I put all my shower time on one day. Ridiculous, right? Immediately you knew that was ridiculous. And it's a good thing I have the flexibility to work from home because my colleagues would not be appreciating me if I showered once a month. Why is it that we have no trouble forgetting to take a shower, that our personal hygiene is second nature, but cyber hygiene is not? Taking a shower is perhaps more fun than internal controls. Hi, Molly. The point is that running reliable, resilient systems, I'm afraid, is about the mundane daily tasks of taking care of your systems. It's not checking occasionally. It's not checking when an audit is about to happen. Oh, I better look at my systems. It's about the daily care and feeding, the daily hygiene of those systems. We are working so hard to help you integrate internal controls into your environments. I've seen so much progress in the last couple years. It's really inspiring to me. So resilience and internal controls go together. One more example of resilience. This is a personal example. Many years ago, my introduction to CIP, I was the SME for CIP 4 and CIP 6. That's how I got into this. I'll give you an example of lack of resilience. Our PACS, Physical Access Control System, was integrated with Active Directory such that for a termination, we could revoke a badge access. One New Year's Day, the code I had written to do this failed and revoked every access in the company. New Year's Day, the code didn't handle the change in a year. Sounds trivial, right? Took 24 hours to restore everyone's access. That is not resilience. Resilience is about code limits, limit checks. If something unusual starts to happen, get an alert, have some monitoring set up, be able to respond quickly. I learned a lot that day. I was certain I would be terminated, but I was working with some cool people who understood and helped me fix it. And there it is, right? So resilience, as we will find out in the session today, is about recovering from a problem rather than prevent problem occurring in the first place. With us today, Joshua Rowe, David Vitkus, Ray Phelps from my team, and we will be focusing. Whoops. Let's get the clicker here. There we go. Okay. We will be having some open questions for the team. I'll be sharing with you perspectives of resilience from NERC, Department of Energy, NIST, and CIP. We'll get into the main questions for the panel, and we'll be focusing on CIP 6, CIP 8, CIP 9, and CIP 14 in that order. We'll have some examples along the way. And of course, we'll have some Q&A. I went the wrong way again. Team, we have two opening questions. And on the first one, I'd like each of you to take all of them. And for the first one, if you could introduce yourself to everyone. And we'll go left to right here, just because that's, I guess, our habit. And Josh, I'll let you start. So the question is, the concept of resiliency does not figure into the CIP standards, except for CIP 14. The CIP standards do not require cyber resilience. So why are we even talking about resiliency? And we'll save the second part of that. Josh, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning to everybody. I'm gonna be a little bit more nervous than Tom. This is the third time that I've been asked to present on a topic that is not included in the reliability standards. I've asked you to do things from CIP 8 before, of develop comprehensive plans for high impact, low frequency events. I've asked you to do PRA assessments that include multiple insider threat things. And now I'm going to ask you to be resilient when it comes to CIP 6 and CIP 8. So bear with me if I'm a little bit nervous. So I brought some notes to talk about today. So we talk about the increase of catastrophic events and how are we going to prepare for those catastrophic events? What mitigation strategies do we have in play? Are we ready for the actual event when it occurs? That's the things you have to ask yourself. It's not when is it going to occur, where it's going to occur. It's how are we going to respond and ensure the continuity of operations when something does occur. So when we talk about resiliency in the standards, we have to build it in ourselves, identify the areas where something can fail and build a plan to grow from it. And if we can start from that concept instead of this is not in the reliability standards, we're going to find ourselves more resilient against all of the threats that we face today.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that so much. So we're going to save the second part of this question. And David, we'll go to you with the same question.
Well, speaking of nervousness, I have to follow Josh. So here we go. I think when we're talking about resiliency, as we've already discussed, we're talking about the ability to respond and recover and maintain operations. And when we're talking in the whole CIP and when we're talking in a CIP context, we're in the business of reliability, right? Can you have a reliable system, a compliant system that's not necessarily resilient? Absolutely. Can you have compliance without being resilient? Yeah. So I think that's why we're really talking about it today, is to, not elevate the bar in terms of compliance, because we've hitched those regulatory horses, to elevate the bar in thinking and approach. Thanks.
Thank you, David. The horse thing is not going to go away. This is awesome. Brady, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not nervous, but as it states, resiliency, that word is in the CIP 14 language, right? R5.1. But it also includes the word or. So that's always fun to have to, work with entities on the resiliency or security measures. So we have a lot to debate about and talk about with that. But I think for CIP 14, as we've gone through 2-3 rounds with some of our entities now on their CIP 14 physical security. I think that resiliency will be how we mature and how we protect our our critical facilities. So
Thank you, Brady. I appreciate you all joining us today. This is a lot of fun for me. Thank you. Rewarding. It's an honor. I'll take the second question on the slide there. No, you're not going to get a PNC for not having resilient systems. But why would you not have resilient systems? Why would you have merely compliant systems? There's way too much risk there. We covered that in detail yesterday, so that's a simple answer. Second question for the panel, Josh. What is the difference between security and resiliency?
Well, I'm gonna look at security measures. So I want to use two things. I'm going to talk about what's a static security, and then I want to talk a little bit about resiliency, but I'm going to use a fun example. So a static system, think of your standard locks, your doors, your perimeter fences, antivirus, the software that's controlling access inbound and outbound, whatever it may be. Those are security measures that are static, currently in place, and you know they're going to be effective as they were designed. So when we look at resiliency, we start thinking of what happens when those systems start to fail. Now, if anybody knows, I'm a video gamer, and so I'm going to use a video game example. It came to me last night in a dream. Anybody play Fortnite? Oh, okay, I got two. Thank you. Anybody's
I
kids
saw
play
three.
Fortnite? Okay, so you might get this one a little bit. So you think of it, you drop into this virtual world with 100 people, and everybody is trying to eliminate you, but you got to win the game, and only one can win it in the very end. Through this, a storm circle starts shrinking in on you. It causes damage, takes away your health points as you scurry out the map, worrying about somebody else trying to eliminate you. Through that process, you find health, you find shield, you find different articles that you can attack opponents with to stay alive. In that, I like to look at that as resilient. I'm being resilient through that storm. I have a plan. I know exactly where on the map I need to go. If I use those tools, if I use the resources appropriately, I hopefully can make it to the end game. That's the ultimate goal. So when I look at resiliency in the CIP standards, have I adequately planned out everything that I need to have? Next person up theory. A lot of the folks in the military are going to be familiar with that. And we'll talk a little bit about that during CIP 8. But think about what can fail and what prevention methods do you have in the event that that failure occurs, or what recovery measures.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate the focus on recovery. That is core. David, from your perspective, what is the difference between security and resiliency?
Well, we've talked a lot about security over the last couple of days, and security is really about risk and controls for prevention and mitigation. So the focus is on prevention. When we're talking about resiliency, we need to just take it up a notch and consider not only risk and controls, compliance, but we need to consider governance. So GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And it takes a balance between those three considerations to make it happen. And I think Josh's example, Fortnite's actually a really good example in terms of, understanding the risks and what tools you have available. The risk and compliance aspect of it is held pretty well in most organizations. It works. Sometimes the governance is a little bit off, which is something that we'll speak to a little later.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the focus on governance. Governance, a key topic for sure. All right, Brady, you know what's coming. What's the difference?
yeah, so when working with these two here and going last, I can see that a lot of my thunder is going to be stolen for the next hour.
We'll switch it up.
Yeah. No, they make great points. And I think from a purely physical security background that I have and looking at the difference between security and resiliency, I think that the two work well together. However, if you are having to rely on resiliency in the form of like a spare parts program or a recovery, it's likely to assume that some function within physical security has failed, because physical security is really there as to prevent or mitigate an attack from ever happening, and therefore you don't need resiliency. But when you have the two combined, it definitely makes for a more robust program. So I think, in short, the difference is one is there to stop anything from ever happening, but if that should fail, resiliency is your backup.
Thank you, Brady. I love the way you tie together prevention and recovery. That is key. Whew, okay, that was part one. Part two is I'm going to share with you some perspectives from the main point of the next few slides is we're not making this stuff up. Resiliency is in the news and it's all over what we do. Perspectives on resiliency. Here we go. This is a screenshot from a relatively recent NERC newsletter in which Mark Lauby talks about the 3Ds. And we have another 3Ds coming up, which is kind of fun. 3Ds: decarbonization, decentralization, and digitization. This is a new world, right? These are our new focus areas. We can't do them if our only focus is reliability and security. We also have to be resilient. And so I love the way resiliency or resilience, synonyms are showing up in the same discussion. Next slide is from almost 10 years ago. NERC put out an FAQ defining reliability. You might not have known that 10 years ago, 9 years ago. The focus at the time was adequacy and security. Adequacy in what terms? In terms of resources, in terms of being able to supply electricity to meet the load. Look at this phrase, virtually all of the time. At this time, virtually had a completely different context than it has today with virtualization. What does virtually all the time mean? It means like hardly ever not do you have electricity. So that's, and there's huge focus still on resource adequacy, and it's important. We have to stay focused on this with the changing fuel mix, but it is no longer the whole picture. At this time, security was defined as the ability of the BPS to withstand sudden, unexpected disturbances. And right about this time, we were adding the context of cyber and physical attacks on the system. Nowhere here are we really talking about recovering from a problem. So look at how much change has happened in less than 10 years. This is from the NERC glossary of terms and what reliable operation means. I'll let you read it. And you'll see some familiar language there from CIP 14 regarding cascading, uncontrolled separation, and instability. So that's fun how these things are tying together. But basically, we are reliable in the context of a sudden disturbance. What that means essentially is that we isolate the problem. And this is the same thing, for example, we deal with as network engineers when there's a network problem and we isolate the network to prevent that problem from moving, cascading to other networks. So these are the same concepts. Resiliency is implied here, but not explicit. Hardening is another concept I'd like you to keep in mind. Hardening refers to prevention. We are applying various methods to prevent things from occurring in the first place. This is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about resiliency As you can see, by contrast, refers to the ability of an energy facility to recover quickly from damage to any of its components, etc. Key shift there. All hazards is a concept I'd like you to keep in mind. All hazards basically means all the bad stuff that could happen to you. It might be a natural event. It might be an attack, physical or cyber. It could be a system failure of some kind. It could be something a human caused inadvertently. Resilience in this context involves preparation and the ability to adapt to changing conditions, to withstand what has happened to your systems and recover rapidly. When I disabled everyone's badge in the company, that was not a rapid recovery. This is from NIST Special Publication 800-160. Cyber resiliency is defined. And here again, we see the core concepts of anticipation, being able to withstand and recover from and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, compromises on our systems. Into our world, CIP 14, another set of Ds, DDDACR refers to deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond. We'll be talking more about that, and I'm going to leave it at that from now. And this is a screenshot from the guidelines and technical bases for the CIP 14 standard. Part 3, questions for the panel. I'm going to switch mics here and hey guys. We're going to start with CIP 6, physical security of BES cyber systems. Then we'll go to CIP 8, then CIP 9 and CIP 14. So we'll be with Josh for the first two. Josh, where do you most often see resiliency in CIP 6?
In the language, you see it really built out in CIP 8, I'm sorry, CIP 6 R1, 1.1 operations or operational procedural controls. That's usually where you're seeing resilience built at its foundation. But to be honest, I really want to focus on where the resilience should be. And that's on R3 for maintenance and testing programs. I think a maintenance and testing program needs to be comprehensive, because if it's not, you're unprepared for the potential catastrophic failure of a physical access control system. So that's where I think we're going to see it the most, is in maintenance and testing. It's not only there. So we'll get into a little bit, I think on the next slide, we'll talk about maintenance and testing for 6.
Very good. Thank you, Josh. So let's go to the next slide. And we have 2 examples of checklists for CIP 6. And maybe Josh, first you could provide, what's the context here for checklists? Do you normally see this as part of the evidence, for example?
You can. I think those that have seen positive observations have had a comprehensive checklist, or they're testing in accordance with manufacturer specifications. So I want to talk a little bit about what we commonly see. We see a lot of testing: door force, door held, invalid badge, valid badge, invalid pin. Those are great tests, and that's compliant. Let me make sure I put that out there. That's what's required, because you have to develop a maintenance and testing program. It doesn't say anywhere in the language what tests need to be performed or what type of maintenance activities should be performed. So this is where you leverage the expertise of those folks that are familiar with PACS to identify what kind of testing should be there. Door force, door held, invalid badge, valid badge, invalid pin, valid pin. Those are the most common. Let me ask you about the maintenance of those. Are you lubricating your door jambs? Are your doors constructed of solid metal or are they wood? If they're wood, are they exposed to the elements where that wood is no longer sustainable? Are your parts corroding in those areas where you have corrosion? Is there rust building up? So we look at some of those. That's great for the maintenance activities. Let's take it a step back and let's go back into testing. Anti-passback, anti-tailgate, the intrusion detection sensors that are inside of your PSP. If you look at the language of the standard, it only says test at the PSP entrances. So what about those glass break sensors that you have on the windows at the control center? How are you testing those? Are you actually testing your program or are you only testing the packs? And let me explain why packs. Servers, workstations, door controllers. That is your definition of packs. But there's multiple components, the peripheral components, the external components, such as the badge reader, the door jams, the request to exit devices. All of those things are part of your PAC system holistically. Now, for audit purposes, I'm going to look at 3 for compliance. If you don't have the other ones, that's when it leads me to asking the questions. Do you have audible sounders? Are you testing them? Do you have duress buttons? Are you testing for power failures, communication failures? Are you testing the voltage in your battery backup to make sure it's adequate? Those are the maintenance and testing activities that your manufacturer has outlined in their PAC system. But are we testing to it? And to be honest, some are. Some are doing a great job. Others are doing the minimum. We haven't called the non-compliance on the minimum, but Scott brought up something really great yesterday that talks about risk. I, as a professional in the security world of physical security, I'm going to tell Scott my professional judgment on your program. And if it's inundated with risk, meaning you're only doing the minimum testing, I'm going to let him know you're compliant and you'll see it, no finding. But what Scott's going to see is my professional assessment of how comprehensive that maintenance and testing program is. Are we really testing that? Because when we start seeing failed components over time, how are we going to be resilient to that? Or if we start having a catastrophic failure, how are we going to respond to that? So the checklist, I just brought it up here just as an example.
What are we looking at here?
So this is a example from an unknown physical access control system test and checkout program. So when you have a newly installed system, your integrator comes out and does all of these tests and certifies the system as pass, fail, yes, no. So just wanted to show, if your manufacturer has one of these cut sheets, ask for it. Develop that kind of checklist to make sure that you're doing a comprehensive review of what that is. And so if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to put 2 examples up there. We won't talk too much about this one. It's just another one for closed circuit television. If you have CCTV at your PSP, that's not a PAX. But your CCTV supports physical access control systems by allowing the security personnel to determine if there was an unauthorized access. And so when we go through this entire program for cameras, does your pan, tilt, zoom work appropriately? Documented in it, but just some checklists. If you have questions, we can talk about it a little bit later, but Tom, I'll pass it back to keep on the time.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate that. Especially appreciate the focus on a holistic view for PACs and the nice distinctions you made with regard to compliance and resiliency. Thank you. I'm not advancing. One moment, please. There we go. We're sticking with CIP 6. Josh, although CIP 6 primarily focuses on physical security perimeters, PSPs, how can entities build resiliency into their program to bolster the overall security posture?
Well, I would like to think of it as what can fail and identifying all of the components that can fail, whether it's a physical component or a programmatic component to it, what can fail and how can you build some sort of fail-safe or redundant capability into it, identify who's responsible for what, how are they trained, what is the periodicity of training for them, refresher training. If you're running things on backup systems, have you tested your backup systems? Have you actually used it in its capacity as a backup, a failover? So really looking at different components to it, peeling back that layer of the onion of here's what I have, but let's start taking a component away at a time and see what I still have and how I can continuously build on that. So I know we're going to run short on time because I like to get long-winded. And so I'm going to leave that one there. And if we're going to talk more about resiliency and physical security perimeters, just catch me on the side and we'll talk more.
Thanks, Josh. I think we're doing okay on time. Yeah, we're in a good spot here. All right. Well, I think we're going to go to CIP 8 now, incident reporting and response planning. And staying with Josh, fifth question for the panel today. CIP 8 is focused on cyber security incident response. How does resiliency fit into that?
Actually wrote this one down, so I'm going to kind of go verbatim with it. Incident response, it shouldn't stop your operations. It should really complement those operations. Prioritization of the incidents by potential impact. If one thing happens, there's likely going to be cascading things that are going to happen. If that does occur, how are you prioritizing that and responding to it adequately? It all really goes into incident response planning. Your exercises and conducting the rehearsals.
Thank you, Josh. Guys, I'm going to bring you in here. Brady, I know we'll be getting more into this, but talk about response from your point of view. Response figures into everything we do. So from your perspective, what are you thinking about when you hear the word response?
Purely from a physical security standpoint or CIP 14?
Physical security. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, response is similar to what you would do in your CIP 8 program as a response to an event. Physical security, gates, guards, and guns, right? So gates and guards are your response to an active attack or what could be an active attack against any of your critical facilities or even, headquarters buildings, pay centers, anything like that. So it's just how we prepare for a likely event and the resources that we provide to be able to respond to that.
Thank you, Brady. I appreciate that. David, we want to get your perspective on response. I know we'll be getting to CIP 9 here in a moment, but from that perspective, how do you think of response?
Well, there isn't much to say beyond what Josh and Brady have already stated, except for perhaps there's a difference between physical response and cyber response.
Yeah, tell me more.
And we'll talk a little bit more about interdependencies later on, but for example, physical response, if I don't know, somebody drives a car into the lobby of headquarters, that's unlikely to shut down your OT. So you don't have a physical dependency in between your operational environment and your corporate environment, but that's not always the case in IT. If you have OT devices that require corporate IT to be working properly, and you lose those, somebody drives a car through your data center, it's a whole different ballgame.
Nice. Appreciate that distinction. Thank you. Next question. Incident response exercises are built into the language of the standard. Could you elaborate upon response planning, exercise, and rehearsals?
Absolutely. This is where I have to bring down to passion because incident response exercises, it's something I really care about. And unfortunately, if you were audited in 2022, you probably received a recommendation that said bolster your incident response exercises to be more comprehensive, inclusive to low impact bad cyber systems. Don't raise your hand if you got that, but you probably did. The reason being is, are we prepared? Are we willing to stress test our actual incident response exercises? How fast is that incident response plan going to actually atrophy if you're only exercising it once every 15 calendar months for medium and high, or once every 36 calendar months for low impact? If you think about that, I would forget how to do daily activities if I didn't do them. So if I'm preparing for a catastrophic response, a malware attack, a DDoS, how am I ready to respond if I've only exercised or stressed my test one time in 15 months? How prepared? What if I'm the one who's responsible for that initial response and I'm on PTO? Who's going to be there to take that step to respond? And so we'll talk a little bit more about, I get really passionate, sorry, incident response
It's all
planning.
good,
is one.
Josh.
So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about lessons learned or an example. And this is an example. This is not an entity's lessons learned document, but I want to run through a couple examples on there.
Thank you, Josh. And I will forget to do daily exercises if I don't do them. How awesome is that? That's pretty cool. Thank you. Here we have an example lessons learned. So Josh, what's going on with this screenshot here?
Again, I want to make sure that everybody knows this is not an entity's document. It's something that I created, and I wanted to bring some attention to common pitfalls and what this tells us and what this does not tell us, and where I look at this from an audit perspective. The first thing that stands out to me is the objectives. Enhance response awareness. Maintain compliance with CIP 8R2. Annual review. Absolutely. Check, you did it. You're compliant. This document, as it's presented today, if you were to present this at audit, you would be compliant. Now, my notes to Scott about the risk, they're going to be pretty lengthy. And let me tell you why. In here, it says to enhance response awareness. Well, that's a small objective, but who are we making aware of this incident response exercise? Maintain compliance, that's a given, that's natural. An annual review, what is that? Those are questions I'm going to ask. Okay, so let's get down to participants. Who's in the room? Do I have the right folks in the room? When you look at this, a compliance analyst, IT specialist, compliance manager, substation operations manager. I don't see anything that says incident response commander. I don't see anything from legal. I don't see anything from communications. So do I have the right people in the room? That's a question I would ask. The next thing is looking at the scenario here. An unintentional removable media device was inserted into an HMI. This is very common for examples. Well, my next step is going to say, is this even a valid scenario? So I reached back, I asked to the folks, what happens if I put removable media into the computer? Well, it doesn't execute. It's not configured to execute upon insertion. So you're now testing a program, or you're testing a scenario that you've already mitigated. It's not even viable in your environment. So what, did you really do this to be compliant, or did you do this to be prepared? So those are the questions that I ask as I go through here. Lessons learned, the absence of lessons learned, that's okay. But if you have an absence of lessons learned, I'm going to ask a lot of questions of, did you really stress this test? And then lastly, the improvements needed, ensure the roster contains current phone numbers, ensure that the communication between different business units is identified. To me, ensure communications between business units, that identifies that there was a failure that occurred. And there should be a lesson learned. So let's investigate that a little bit more. Let's have some more questions. So as you're planning all of these events, you're looking at it, make sure we have the appropriate people in the room. Again, if you're doing it once every 15 calendar months, I'm gonna say compliant. But if you're doing it biannually, or if you're doing it quarterly with smaller groups, really stressing it, that's great. GridX is a great opportunity to participate. I've asked folks if it was beneficial for that. We received some feedback. We passed it back to our event analysis and situational awareness groups for some potential incident response stuff. But what I'm asking you to do is really stress test your incident response plan. Try to break it. Find a way that you can enhance your productivity in response activities by removing a key person from that event as it's occurring. Do it off hours. And if you can do those things, you're going to find out if your incident response plan is actually resilient to response, or if it's there for compliance.
Awesome. Breaking things is fun, right? So these things can be fun, and recovering can be fun. Appreciate the tie to GridX there. Lessons learned equals none. Come on. Really? You didn't learn anything? Would it be fair to say no one should copy this into their compliance evidence?
I wouldn't unless you want to have detailed conversations. That's going to lead to a really long interview and a lot of notes to Scott. And I'm really not that fast of a typer. But no, I think I wanted to show this, that it is compliant, but the risk is there. Where are the controls? Because I got to go back and I got to do my job. My customer is the risk engineer, the internal control specialist, or the enforcement and mitigation engineer. I have to serve my customer with all of the information they need, and I have to tell the story. I can tell the compliance story very easy, no finding. But if there's risk, that takes a lot more time. So again, should you do this? Yes, for compliance. If you really want to get into having CIP 8 in your audit scope every time, that's the document you need. But I would encourage you to take it a little bit beyond. I don't have examples readily available, but we can talk through as needed.
Thank you,
Thank you, Tom.
Josh. You're welcome. Of course, reach out to us. That's why we're here. And even when we're not here, please reach out to us. We're going to go to CIP 9 now. David, you're on point. These CIP 9 is recovery plans for BES cyber systems. And we have a two-part question here. We'll do one at a time. How does CIP 9 recovery planning contribute to resiliency?
Well, when you consider resiliency as the ability to quickly recover from an event in your systems, it's in the definition. So recovery planning and recovery testing, which are both required in the standard, contribute to resiliency by allowing you to recover so the lights don't go out permanently. And, speaking of recovery testing, Josh brought up a really good point about, who's involved and how much does the exercise approximate a potential real world scenario. In CIP 9, we don't audit it often, but in CIP 9 evidence, we see the plans and we see the recovery tests, and it looks good. It's compliant, but how often is that test run in conjunction with, say, a GridX exercise or in conjunction with the incident response testing? So we wouldn't let loose the regulatory horses over the minimums, but it's worth thinking about integrating recovery exercises and incident response exercises just to raise that bar a little bit. And it kind of goes back to the governance, risk, and compliance aspects of it. CIP 9 gives us the compliance and the risk assessments. Well, CIP 9 is kind of boring, right? All those risks kind of come to us from the standard. So it's not as thrilling as CIP 8, but they need to be considered, so consider integrating those tests and, if possible, engage leadership. The CIP senior manager is responsible for everything down through the standards, and see if you can't find opportunities to integrate testing across standards and across teams.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate the way you bring CIP 8 and CIP 9 together. Of course, they're natural allies. Part 2 of this question: what are the limitations of CIP 9 when it comes to resilience? Maybe that should be resiliency, but we'll treat them as synonyms.
I think the limitation is the fact that it only covers BES systems.
Nice.
There's the Colonial Pipeline attack is a really good example. An attack on the financial systems in corporate forced them to shut down their OT systems. It was essentially a denial of service attack by proxy. So that's got to be a really bitter pill to swallow. Those systems were down for about 7 days, and they ended up paying the ransom and got their systems back up. But it begs the question, had they tested their systems, had they known what the recovery timeline would be for the financial systems, and had they known about the risk and the interdependencies between IT and OT, that situation might have played out a little differently.
Thank you, David. And we'll be talking more about Colonial in one of the examples. Critical infrastructure and interdependencies are treated as supply chain or incident response problems. Where does recovery planning fit in here?
Well, it's again, SIP 9 is just not as interesting as fun and as fun as incident response, because it's recovery. But I think that recovery planning probably gets less attention than it should. And I say that because if you've got to the point where you're pulling out your recovery plans, you're in real trouble in both reliability and resiliency terms. So I really think that focusing on good recovery testing and also taking a really careful look at the risks in those interdependencies is critical.
Thank you, David. And the whole premise of GridX is something awful has happened, a breach has happened, and we're going to recover from it. So we've assumed breach, as we discussed earlier today, and we are now going to practice recovering from it. Here we go, SIP 14. First question, Brady. Please share your thoughts on the use of the word resiliency in requirement 5.1 of SIP 14 and the guidelines and technical basis.
Sure, yeah. I really wish I had come up with a horse pun for this. I feel like I'm not keeping up here, but so yeah, resiliency is in there, resiliency or security measures. I think that it plays an important role from the aspect of how we should recover to reduce the impact, to mitigate the impact that a successful attack would have on our critical facilities. If you're one of those entities that through your studies have identified those type of sites. So when you look at, we saw a little bit in that screenshot of, I think it was topographical changes, spare parts programs, and being able to move energy around, right? So the biggest thing that I'm seeing right now, and I had mentioned it earlier, is it's playing a role in the maturation of what entities are doing with their physical security. We can go all the way back to when we first started, and that resiliency or was a problem because it was interpreted as you could either have a spare parts program only or do physical security. But when you look at the language of the standard and really the intent of that, there's a lot of language in there that really makes it almost impossible to completely rely on a spare parts program only. And I think maybe the next slide.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. So, and back to resiliency again, too. I was looking at how does security actually fall into resiliency? One is prevention and one is recovery. I couldn't really find anything in the physical security world that had a clear definition of how security plays a role in that. But you saw the NIST definition earlier, and I really like that. And so I took some of the language from that and I applied it to what we do in SIP 14, R4, and R5. So back at that NIST, you had the ability to anticipate. What is that? So that's, you're developing your threat and vulnerability assessment, and you deploy technology to detect any of the design basis threats or DBT, adversarial sequence diagrams, ASDs, whatever you're coming up with, that's a real and likely attack vector that may occur to your site given its unique characteristics. But that TVA and your measures to detect are the ability to anticipate. Then we move to withstand. So you're deploying measures to deter, delay, and respond. You're withstanding an attack should it happen. And then we move to recover from. That's where the spare parts program, business continuity, SIP 8, EOP 4, all of that come into play as a recovery portion of that. And then finally, adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromise. And you can really tie that to R5.3, future enhancements, and then 5.4 measures. So evolving threats and their corresponding security measures. So you're adapting to what may happen through 5.3 and 5.4.
Thank you, Brady. I really appreciate the mapping to NIST there. Julie, I couldn't read that. Was it 10 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, moving along to question 10.
Oh boy.
We have seen entities relying on a spare parts program as part of the response requirement in R5.1. Is this an effective response?
Yeah, I had a really long-winded explanation for this, but I'm gonna try to cut it short. So it's not, because when you look at 5.1, measures to deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond. A spare parts program does not deter anything. It does not detect anything. It does not delay anything. It does not assess or communicate. It simply is a response after a successful attack. If you're having to put spare parts programs, activate a spare parts program, you've essentially failed CIP 14 because you've had a successful attack on your critical facility, and it might be some components or it could be a smoking hole. It's supplemental to the mitigation of recovery after response. But in 5.1, it's mitigation and responding prior to instability, cascading, and separation.
Thank you, Brady. And CIP 14 really led the way with focus on effectiveness. And now many other standards in our world are dealing with that concept too. We'll go right past this. This is what is in the language of the requirement: deter, detect, delay, respond, communicate, and assess. One more question. How should we think of resiliency for physical security?
I think that it's, I want to say that it's almost synonymous with each other. So in physical security, again, I'm trying to think of how can I get beyond that recovering from an actual realized attack. And I think that a resilient physical security program is synonymous with defense in depth. So multiple complementary measures to deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond. And I'll give a really good example of this real quick. So if you have deployed shot detection at your critical facilities, I just went to the ASIS grid or security expo, and I went and harassed all the shot detection companies. And what they can't do is they cannot detect suppressed subsonic ammunition. It moves too slow and it's too quiet, and it's going off sound. So shot detection's picking up that break in the sound barrier of how fast a round is traveling towards your critical assets. And so how do we make a resilient system when you've identified a vulnerability in one of your measures? Well, you might be able to combine that with a ground-based radar or additional cameras given a unique characteristic of that site, like say a hill. So really digging into what your security measures are capable of and what they're not capable of, and then filling in any of those gaps. That would be resiliency, in my opinion.
Thank you, Brady. Appreciate the focus on capability and gaps. Those are key concepts here. I think we have time for, are we done? 2 minutes, okay.
Yeah, I can get through this one real quick too. So yeah, what is the most effective use of operational resiliency you've seen in your CIP 14 audit? So I have seen operational resiliency is, and next slide, we'll just pull this up right here.
Awesome.
So don't make fun of this. I made this in like 3 minutes. That's my fancy substation right there. And so I saw an entity that had 3 zones, right? They had ground-based radar, CCTV, and shot detection, but they worked really closely with their grid operations folks, and they had constant communications. It was almost like a combined security operations center that include IT and then also grid operations. So once zone detection 1 happens, that security operations center is letting the grid operators know, hey, somebody's there. We don't know who they are. Zone 2 CCTV, they're able to identify a rifle, right? Zone 3 shot detection, a round has gone off. You have 3 layers there where security is in constant communication with grid operations. And once zone 3 happens, grid operations know we need to start moving energy around and taking the power of instability, cascading, and separation away from the attackers and taking control of that.
Thank you, Brady, so much. We're going to skip this example. Please follow. Am I on here? Yeah. Okay. Let me. Now I am. Okay. That was interesting. Maybe it senses me. We're going to skip these examples here. And please feel free to find us and we'll follow up on that. I'm going to conclude with a thank you here. What we all did during COVID-19 is an amazing example of resilience. You moved staff to alternate work locations. You had operator isolation and quarantine. You kept working. We kept auditing. Thank you. These are amazing examples of human resilience. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. And we appreciate you so much. And we're here for questions all day. And anytime, please follow up with us. Hi, Steve.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for that. What a great presentation. I think it underscores the importance of, the obligation that we have to understand how well entities are developing and designing their programs as an input for the actions that we take in response to that. So appreciate that. You'll hear more about that in a little bit. So